Ohio looks ordinary on the map, cornfields, football, highways that never end. But beneath that surface is a ledger of people who vanished without explanation. 33 stories. 33 names. Some walked into thin air, some were found but never truly identified, and some reappeared decades later only as whispers of who they once were. Tonight, we're not chasing answers, we're stepping into the silence. Welcome to 33 Ohio Missing People Mysteries That Cannot Be Explained. Buckle in. Because what disappears in Ohio doesn't always stay gone. It lingers, watching, waiting, daring you to look closer. Before we dive in, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next deep descent into the unexplained. And while you're here in the dark with me, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Because these stories don't care if it's morning, midnight, or somewhere in between, they haunt just the same. Brian Schaffer, 2006, Columbus. There's a type of disappearance that isn't loud. It doesn't involve a dramatic getaway or a crime scene taped off with yellow ribbons. No broken windows, no scattered belongings. Just a door, or in this case, a stairwell that someone walks through, and then nothing. Brian Schaffer was not the kind of person people expected to vanish. A 27-year-old Ohio State University medical student, Brian was charismatic, intelligent, and on the verge of proposing to his girlfriend. His mother had just passed away from a long illness. Grief still hung around him like a loose coat, but by all accounts, he was coping, functioning, looking forward to spring break in Miami with the woman he loved. The world saw a man in motion, but on the 1st of April, 2006, all that motion stopped cold. It was the night before that trip to Miami. Brian and his friend Clint met up at the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a now infamous bar in the short North District of Columbus. The place had a cartoonish name, an escalator entrance, and an ironic reputation for being a little too easy to get into, and a little too hard to get out of. The night progressed like so many college nights do. Drinks, noise, the lull of neon, and eventually, Brian is seen on the bar's CCTV footage, 1:15 a.m. He steps just out of frame, toward the service area near the back. A side hallway with an emergency exit and some stairs. And then, he doesn't come back. Ever. Security footage never captured him leaving. Not by the front escalator, not by the side exit, not through the service area. The police reviewed every second of tape, forward, backward, frame by frame, looking for a glimpse of Brian. Nothing. No hat pulled down, no hoodie, no misdirection, just gone. And here's where it starts to shift from tragedy into something stranger. The bar had one entrance and one known exit, both monitored. The back area, supposedly, led to a locked construction zone. But what if Brian had found a way out there? A fire exit? A maintenance tunnel? Could he have slipped past security while they blinked? Or, the less satisfying possibility, what if he never left the building at all? Some speculated that he was hiding, that the grief over his mother's death had metastasized into something inward, and that he just walked away from his life. But that theory melts in the heat of the facts. No credit card activity, no passport use, no confirmed sightings. A man who loved music, medicine, and his girlfriend simply evaporated into Columbus nightlife like breath on a mirror. His father, Randy, never gave up. He rented billboards, gave interviews, haunted forums. But in 2008, tragedy struck again. Randy died in a freak accident during a windstorm when a tree fell on him in his yard. A private online condolence book opened to the public after his death. Among the messages was one, anonymous, that simply read, "Dad, I love you, Brian." Traced, eventually, to a public computer in Franklin County. It was a cruel prank, of course. Just another echo. Years passed. Theories got weirder. Brian was kidnapped by human traffickers. Brian joined a monastery. Brian had a psychotic break and started a new life somewhere warm and off the grid. A photo surfaced of a man living in Tijuana who looked eerily like him. The FBI ran facial recognition. Not him. Another dead end. And yet, here's the part no one likes. If he had died in that building, wouldn't someone have found something by now? A body in a ceiling panel? A piece of clothing in an air duct? 15 years and a dozen remodels later, not a trace. So maybe the most unnerving thing isn't that Brian vanished, it's that no one can agree on where the mystery even begins. Was it before he walked out of frame? Or after? Because if someone can walk into a bar and never walk out and there's no evidence either way, then the question isn't what happened to Brian Schaefer. It's how many people are watching you right now who'll swear they saw you leave. And if a man can disappear inside a place filled with people, lights, cameras, and friends, then what happens in the dark corners of family gatherings where the lights are dimmer, the people younger, and the exits more emotional? Ashley Summers was only 14 when she vanished. Ashley Summers, 2007, Cleveland. It's easy to imagine Cleveland in July. Hot sidewalks, cicadas grinding in the trees, the haze of fireworks still lingering in the air weeks after Independence Day. It's the kind of weather where families spill out onto porches, neighbors shout across alleyways, and everything smells faintly of smoke, sunscreen, and childhood tension. On the 4th of July weekend in 2007, 4-year-old Ashley Summers was a typical teenager wrapped in this Midwest summer film strip, sharp-tongued, headstrong, moody in the way that only 4-year-olds can be when they're trying to outrun the slow ache of growing up. She was spending time with family uncles, cousins, the usual rotating door of relatives who defined her summers. On the 6th of July, somewhere between one house and another in the west side of Cleveland, she vanished. Just like that. No fight, no storm, no cry for help. She was walking a few blocks to her great-uncle's house, something she'd done many times. But this time, she never arrived. Her family didn't panic right away. Ashley had a bit of a rebellious streak, as many teenagers do. She'd dyed a streak of red into her hair, had recently gotten a tattoo of her name on her arm, and had started asserting her independence. So when she didn't come home right away, some thought she was blowing off steam. Maybe she'd gone to cool off. Maybe she was with a friend. Maybe she just needed a night away from the noise of family. But one night turned into two. Two turned into a week. And by then, the silence had taken root. The case officially began as a runaway. Police treated it like teenage angst with sneakers. No signs of foul play, no broken window, no final note. But the problem with treating a teenager like a fugitive from her own life is that you miss the slow bleed of detail that comes with time. Small things don't get followed up. Crucial days are lost. And when the assumption is that someone doesn't want to be found, the search never starts with urgency, it starts with doubt. Ashley didn't take a phone. She didn't take money. She didn't pack clothes. Her mother insists she would have told someone if she were planning to leave for real. Her boyfriend said the same. But assumptions are seductive when they're all you've got. And in 2007, Cleveland had other missing girls to worry about. Too many. For years, Ashley's case existed in a kind of suspended animation. Not ignored, but not pursued. Not urgent, but not closed. Family members created posters. Her face was added to milk cartons and missing person websites. But even her relatives sometimes wavered. Was she out there, angry and alone, choosing to be absent? Or had something worse happened before anyone realized she was truly gone? Then came the horror of 2013. In a nondescript house on Seymour Avenue, less than 3 miles from where Ashley disappeared, 3 women were rescued from captivity. Gina DeJesus, Amanda Berry, Michelle Knight. They had been held for years by a man named Ariel Castro, and the discovery shook Cleveland to its core. Suddenly, All the names that had become faded posters and unsolved backlogs were back in the air again. And Ashley's was at the front of that storm. The question everyone asked was the same. Could she have been there too? The FBI investigated the possibility. Ashley had known of the area. She was close in age to the other victims, and the timelines overlapped enough to raise eyebrows. For a while, it seemed possible. Castro's home was torn apart by investigators, searching for evidence of other captives. But no trace of Ashley was found. Not a single hair, not one object she could have touched. No hidden room. No note etched into the wall. It was a dead lead that should have brought closure, but instead it reopened the wound. Since then, there have been rumors. People claim to have seen Ashley in Rhode Island. A girl resembling her appeared on a surveillance video years later at a bank in the Midwest. But none of these leads held. They evaporated under scrutiny, just like her footsteps on that sidewalk. What makes Ashley's case so haunting isn't just the disappearance, it's the void she left. No trace, no confirmed sighting, no confession. It's a story made entirely out of things that didn't happen. And over time, the silence has become its own kind of presence. A ghost, not of a girl, but of a system that moves on when the missing person is just young enough, just rebellious enough, just assumed enough to not warrant the spotlight. Her family still hopes. They've spoken to the press, kept her photo on digital billboards, refused to forget. And the FBI still lists her among their active missing cases, which is rare. But even with time, there's been no shift. Just the same unyielding wall of not knowing. So what do you do when a city fails you? When the truth may lie in 100 square feet of distance and a decade's worth of bad assumptions? What if the most dangerous place for a missing girl isn't the street at all, but the space between two people who assume someone else is watching? And, speaking of bad assumptions, Tyler Davis was supposed to be in a hotel with his wife, but somehow, at 3 a.m., he walked off into thin air instead. 2 mysteries down, and already Ohio feels less like a state and more like a maze. If you're still with me, don't forget to subscribe. This rabbit hole only gets darker from here. And while you're at it, drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it on your clock? Because whether it's daylight or dead of night, these disappearances sound different depending on when you hear them. Tyler Davis, 2019, Columbus, Easton Town Center. By the time Tyler Davis disappeared, America had already become fluent in a certain kind of missing person story. The grainy CCTV image, the frantic Facebook post, the threadbare press conference. The algorithm of absence. But Tyler's case didn't feel like a formula. It felt like a glitch in the matrix. A man steps out of a hotel for a walk. A normal man. A new father. 29 years old. Stone sober. Married. And then, a pocket dial. A voice on the line. And silence. Tyler Davis didn't vanish in a national park. He wasn't on a cross-country trip. He wasn't hiking into wilderness with nothing but a compass and good intentions. He was at Easton Town Center, a sprawling outdoor shopping mall in Columbus, Ohio, ringed with retail stores, chain restaurants, fountains, parking garages, and enough surveillance cameras to make the NSA blush. If you wanted to disappear in a controlled environment, Easton is the last place you'd choose. It's sanitized, curated, designed to be relentlessly visible. But that's exactly where Tyler Davis became invisible. It started innocuously enough. Tyler and his wife, Brittany, had come to Columbus to celebrate their anniversary. A staycation, more or less. Their infant son was safe with family. It was meant to be a rare night-away dinner, drinks, a hotel suite, the fragile illusion of youth still lingering on the other side of parenthood. They met up with a friend. They had a few drinks. Brittany said Tyler wasn't drunk, just tired. It was late, but not late enough to be tragic. Around 3 a.m., they returned to their hotel near Easton. For reasons that remain unclear, Tyler and the friend decided to go for a short walk while Brittany went inside to rest. Just a walk, nothing more. Then the friend returned, alone. According to him, Tyler had decided to circle back on his own, take a slightly different path, maybe to clear his head, maybe for privacy, maybe for nothing at all. He wasn't upset. He wasn't in distress. He just walked a different direction, in an area laced with sidewalks, lampposts, and GPS-enabled phones. The last known contact was a phone call Tyler made to Brittany around 3:37 a.m. She said he sounded confused, like he didn't know where he was. His words were disjointed. He kept saying he was cutting through the woods, even though there are barely any woods in the Easton area. Not real ones, just manicured green spaces and a few tree-lined lots along the highway. Still, she could hear his voice. He said he was close. He said he'd be back soon. And then, the line went dead. Tyler's phone last pinged a tower near Abbott Labs, just east of Easton, at 3:53 a.m. After that, nothing. No more calls, no pings, no sightings. The phone either died or was turned off. And just like that, a husband and father disappeared into the commercial heart of suburban Columbus as if the ground had politely opened and closed behind him. The search began quickly. Police used dogs, drones, grid searches, surveillance footage. They scoured Easton's parking lots, retention ponds, stairwells, rooftops. Nothing. Not a shoe, not a wallet, not a body. It was like the entire infrastructure of modern surveillance, built to track purchases, faces, license plates, was suddenly rendered obsolete by a single man on foot in the middle of the night. And that's where things get strange. There were no reports of someone matching his description walking in distress. No traffic accidents, no emergency room walk-ins, no evidence he was being followed. Friends and family have always insisted Tyler wasn't the type to just run off. He was proud of his new role as a father. He'd been in good spirits. There was no history of mental health issues. No debt, no criminal record, no double life waiting in the wings. And yet, every possible path, foul play, medical emergency, intentional disappearance, feels like a bad fit. The woods he mentioned in the phone call? They don't exist in the way he described. There's some brush behind the nearby buildings, a creek in the distance, but nothing deep enough to truly disappear into without someone hearing you scream or seeing you go in. And certainly not without someone finding you eventually. So maybe the question isn't what direction Tyler went. Maybe it's what reality he slipped out of. Because there's a pattern in stories like these. The person vanishes in a liminal zone, a shopping mall at 3 a.m., a college bar's back hallway, the space between destinations. These aren't crimes of opportunity. They're acts of erasure. As if someone or something is watching the clock, waiting for the moment when no one else is looking and then taking their chance. Years later, Brittany still posts on social media. She still answers questions, still asks her own. And the tragedy of it all is that Tyler did everything people are told to do to avoid becoming a missing person. He stayed in public. He called home. He said he was on his way. And then he was nowhere. Which brings us to another case where the missing didn't start with a vanishing, but with someone being found. Not alive, not intact, but still leaving behind a mystery that refuses to stay buried. Because when Caitlin Markham disappeared, the truth came out, but only after a decade, a corpse, and a confession no one really saw coming. Caitlin Markham, 2011, Fairfield. Caitlin Markham had a face that looked like it belonged on missing person flyers. Big eyes, straight teeth, the all-American composite we've come to associate with unspeakable outcomes. But in life, she was more than that. A two-year-old art student with a habit of drawing dreamy, surreal illustrations. She was preparing to graduate from the Art Institute of Cincinnati. She had a job at David's Bridal, a fiancé she lived with, and a future that seemed decently sketched out, if not fully inked in. She wanted to move to Colorado, start over, begin her real life. But real life didn't come. It was the 13th of August, 2011, when she vanished. No sign of forced entry. No packed bags. No broken glass. No screaming. Just gone. Her fiancé, John Carter, was the one who first sounded the alarm. He told police he'd last seen her at their townhouse in Fairfield, Ohio. She was behaving normally. They'd talked about wedding plans, their move out west, the usual young couple logistics. Nothing seemed wrong. But the next day, when he couldn't reach her, he went to check. Her car was still there. Her purse and keys were inside. Her dog, a loyal husky mix named Murphy, was waiting, confused. But Caitlin? Caitlin was nowhere. The investigation, predictably, fell into the usual trenches. Interviews, canvassing, polygraphs, search parties walking in zigzag patterns through wooded parks and roadside ditches. But the problem with normal-seeming disappearances is that they don't leave you any breadcrumbs, just dust and footprints you can't follow. Carter gave interviews. He cried on camera. He appeared utterly broken. He called her his everything. For years, he seemed like a grieving man doing what he could. For a while, it was enough. But time didn't cooperate. It just dragged. Then, nearly 2 years later, in 2013, skeletal remains were found in a remote area of Cedar Grove, Indiana, about 30 miles from where she disappeared. It was spring, and someone had been dumping trash near a creek when they found something not quite belonging in the pile. It was Caitlin, or what was left of her. Her identification was confirmed quickly, but not much else. The cause of death couldn't be determined due to decomposition. No gunshot, no stab wound, just bones and time and silence. With the recovery of her body, the story should have found its conclusion, but instead, it just became a colder case with a grave attached. John Carter remained in the public eye, sometimes awkwardly so. In interviews, he vacillated between grief and defensiveness. He said he'd passed a polygraph, that police had cleared him. But the rumors followed him like a shadow he couldn't quite outrun. Some said he knew more than he let on. Others said he was just the unfortunate center of a tragedy. No charges were filed. For years. Then came the phone call. In 2020, a private investigator working on the case released a series of recorded conversations between Carter and a man named Sam, his friend, confidant, and perhaps unwitting confessor. In one of these calls, Carter could be heard saying things that raised more than eyebrows. He sounded panicked. He mentioned Caitlin's body being in Indiana before it was discovered. He talked about things he shouldn't have known. Still, it took 4 more years to act. In 2024, John Carter was arrested, tried, and convicted for her murder. Prosecutors alleged a domestic argument turned violent, that he panicked, that he moved her body across state lines, dumped it in the woods, and pretended to be the grieving partner for over a decade. And then the sentence came. Years behind bars. A final judgment. So now the case is closed. But the mystery? Not quite. Because here's the thing. If the person responsible was the one who stood at the front of the search, what does that say about the way we perceive guilt? Carter went on television, pleaded for help, cried with the parents. He was the one who first dialed 911, the one who showed up, and yet, he was the one to end it all? If that's true, the real horror isn't the crime, it's the performance that followed. The tears, the statements, the memorial tattoos, the rituals of grief, performed with the same hands that caused it. And what if it isn't true? What if we got it wrong? What if we were so desperate for a culprit, we accepted a story that just happened to fit the timing? People lie, evidence decays, and convictions, even in 2024, aren't immune to doubts. But whether Carter is truly guilty or not, one fact is undeniable. Caitlin is still gone. Her drawings stopped. Her plans for Colorado remain sealed in a storage box somewhere. Her dog never saw her again. And so the tragedy folds into itself, becoming a parable not just about loss, but about how little we actually know the people closest to us. The ones who say goodnight, the ones who call you baby and plan your future. Because sometimes, the person holding your hand isn't leading you to safety, they're leading you to the vanishing point. And speaking of vanishing point, Erica Baker walked a dog into a public park in broad daylight. One of them returned, the other never did. Erica Baker, 1999, Kettering. You don't expect something to go missing on a cloudy Sunday afternoon. Not a 9-year-old girl. Not from a park. Not in Kettering, Ohio, a place so quintessentially suburban it might as well have been designed by a committee of concerned mothers and zoning ordinances. Everything in Kettering feels intentional. The rows of modest homes, the neatly trimmed lawns, the public spaces nestled between blocks like polite handshakes between neighborhoods. It's not the kind of place you vanish from. But Erica Baker did. And she didn't vanish in the dark, or in the wilderness, or at the end of a reckless detour. She vanished in the open, during daylight, while walking her dog. That dog, her grandmother's Shih Tzu named Jamie, was found within the hour, soaking wet, wearing its leash. But Erica? Not a trace. It was the 7th of February, 1999. The sky was heavy with the kind of gray Ohio specializes in dull, featureless, slightly ominous, but not quite threatening. Erica asked her grandparents if she could walk the dog around Indian Riffle Park, a well-known public park adjacent to the Kettering Recreation Center. It was barely a block away. She was wearing a pink raincoat. It should have been a 20-minute outing, maybe less, but by dinner, Erica hadn't come back. The initial response was what you'd expect: family searching nearby, calling her name, checking playgrounds, peering through fences. The police were notified quickly. Volunteers mobilized. The park and surrounding neighborhoods were combed over with an intensity that only grows when the missing is a child. But it was as if the earth had opened briefly and politely swallowed one person. Only one. Everything else, the leash, the dog, the drizzle of rain, remained intact. In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire across southwest Ohio. Posters went up. Helicopters scanned the area. Hundreds of searchers walked shoulder to shoulder through the woods and storm drains. But nothing was found, no clothes, no backpack, no shoe, no body. And while the world was busy drawing its conclusions, a theory started to circulate. One that came not from hard evidence, but from a gnawing kind of absence. Someone had hit her with a car. Not just anyone. A man named Christian Gabriel eventually came under intense scrutiny. A known felon, a man with a history of poor decisions and worse explanations. Years later, he would be charged not with murder or abduction, but with tampering with evidence and abuse of a corpse. According to law enforcement, he admitted to hitting Erica with a van, panicking, and hiding her body, but he refused to say where, claimed he couldn't remember, said it was too long ago. Memory was hazy. Details had slipped. He went to prison for the tampering charge and got out in 2011. Still, no one knows where Erica is. You would think that admission might close the book. But the confession did something strange. It made the mystery heavier, not lighter. Because now there was no more illusion of maybe, no more fantasy of Erica living under a different name, raised by a secretive stranger. No chance that she was just lost. According to Gabriel, she died that day, but there's no body, no accident report, no witnesses, just a confession buried under years of lies and sealed court documents. And maybe the cruelest part? That confession wasn't even public for years. People still theorize about Gabriel's motives. Was it really an accident? Was there someone else in the van? Did he act alone? Or was his story just a smokescreen, designed to offer the kind of resolution that lets people stop asking questions? Because there's always been a gap between what he says and what he does. A man who can't remember where he left a body isn't really confessing. He's narrating a story without an ending. Her parents never stopped looking. They've marked birthdays, eulogized anniversaries. They've walked the same fields over and over, hoping something overlooked might rise to the surface like a clue thawing in the spring. But nothing ever does. So what happens when you know who did it, but you don't know what they did? You build a shrine to speculation. You tell yourself a story that feels just incomplete enough to be livable. Maybe she died quickly. Maybe she didn't suffer. Maybe someone tried to do the right thing and just didn't know how. But deep down, you know the truth has been traded for convenience. The town of Kettering still remembers her. There are murals, prayer walks, roadside signs fading under the Sunday. People still say her name. But the space she left behind, that invisible shape of a 9-year-old who never came home, has outlasted the signs. It's carved into the town's DNA now, a ghost made of rain and routine. And if Erica could disappear in broad daylight, during a routine walk in a safe place, then maybe safety isn't a place at all. Maybe it's just an illusion people agree to believe in, until someone vanishes. Beverly Potts vanished too, but she did it in the 1952nd. And if you think things were simpler back then, try explaining how a 10-year-old could go to a neighborhood talent show and never walk home again. Beverly Potts, 1951, Cleveland. If the past is a foreign country, then 1952nd Cleveland might be the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked, neighbors borrow sugar without asking, and children are trusted to roam freely until dusk settles like a quilt over the streets. At least, that's the myth we like to believe. But nostalgia is a selective narrator. It forgets what it's told to forget. And when Beverly Potts vanished on the 24th of August, 1951, the city realized that even in its so-called golden age, monsters didn't always come with a warning label. Beverly was 10, a quiet girl, brown hair, a solemn face, the kind of child who always followed the rules, even when no one was watching. She lived with her parents and older sister in a modest home on Linnet Avenue, on Cleveland's west side. That Friday evening, she went with a friend to Halloran Park, just a few blocks away, to see a local talent show. The event was part of the city's Showagon program, a traveling stage where neighborhood kids performed songs, dances, magic tricks, and the like. Harmless, celebratory. A summer ritual built on community and clumsy showmanship. The show ended at 9:30 p.m. Beverly's friend left early. Beverly stayed. She said she wanted to see the rest of the performance, and that was the last time anyone saw her. It wasn't until the next morning that her parents realized something was wrong. They'd assumed she was sleeping over at her friend's house. The friend's parents assumed she'd returned home. It was a perfectly timed misunderstanding, innocent on its face, devastating in effect. By the time anyone began looking, hours had passed. Crucial hours. The search began immediately. Police scoured the park. Volunteers canvassed the neighborhood. Within 48 hours, over 500 officers and citizens were involved. No effort was spared. The mayor got involved. The FBI was consulted. The press turned Beverly's face into a symbol of stolen innocence. Cleveland, a city built on industry and grit, was now paralyzed by the idea that a child could be erased from its streets without so much as a sound. Leads came in, of course. Dozens, then hundreds. People reported suspicious men, strange cars, shadowy figures lurking near the park that night. A few people claimed to have seen Beverly walking home, but the stories were inconsistent, the timeline slippery. One woman said she saw a girl matching Beverly's description being pulled into a car. Another said she saw Beverly talking to a man in the shadows, but none of it stuck. The details were too vague. The stories changed, and eventually the noise drowned out the signal. Years passed. Tips dwindled. The case grew cold. But Beverly never really disappeared from Cleveland's memory. Her name became part of local folklore, whispered at slumber parties and school assemblies. Parents used her story as a cautionary tale. Newspaper columns revisited the case every few years, usually near the anniversary. Some theorized she had been abducted by a traveling salesman. Others suggested a neighbor. There were even rumors that she had been buried in the park itself, beneath the very grass she once sat on to watch the Showagon performers. The park was searched, dug up, examined. Nothing. In the 1972nd, a new theory surfaced, a confession letter, postmarked from another state, claiming responsibility for Beverly's disappearance. The letter was filled with remorse, vague details, and an alleged deathbed conscience. But handwriting analysis proved inconclusive. No name was ever confirmed. And then, like everything else, it faded into the vault of almosts. Perhaps the most haunting thing about Beverly's case is that no one has ever been arrested. No body has ever been found. No single theory has ever been universally accepted. The case remains open, technically, though it lives more as a symbol than an investigation. The name Beverly Potts doesn't just refer to a child anymore. It refers to a wound, to a cultural memory of safety that was revealed to be paper thin. What does it mean when a 10-year-old disappears from a public park during a community event? What does it say about trust, about perception, about the fragility of systems built on assumed protection? Beverly didn't go out to meet a stranger. She went out to enjoy something joyful and safe. She disappeared within the boundaries of normalcy, and that's what makes it so impossible to make peace with. Because if Beverly could vanish without a trace in 1951 inch, with the age of unlocked doors and nosy neighbors, then the real myth isn't about innocence. It's about certainty. The comforting illusion that we've ever truly known how to protect our children, our communities, or ourselves. And that illusion only deepens when you jump ahead 30 years to another Ohio teen who went to a party and never came home. His name was Kurt Sova. His story has more witnesses, more questions, and somehow, even fewer answers. Kurt Sova, 1981, Newburgh Heights. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a teenager's disappearance. It doesn't roar like a child's case, and it doesn't hum with the weary gravity of an adult's vanishing. It just sort of lingers. People shrug. They say he probably ran away. They whisper things about parties, bad influences, youthful mistakes. It's easier, sometimes, to assign blame than admit confusion. But Kurt Sova wasn't the kind of kid anyone expected to disappear. He was 17 years old in October 1981, a junior at Newburgh Heights High School, just southeast of Cleveland. Slender, dark-haired, with an awkward handsomeness that hadn't quite grown into itself yet. He was quiet, respectful, a little shy, and like most 17-year-olds, trying to find out where he fit in the world. He didn't have a history of skipping school or running away. He wasn't chasing chaos or hiding secrets. He was just a teenager, which, in some stories, turns out to be the most dangerous thing you can be. On the 23rd of October, Kurt told his parents he was going out with a friend, nothing unusual, a Friday night. He didn't say where exactly he was going, just that he'd be back soon. They believed him, why wouldn't they? But he didn't come back. Not that night, not the next morning. It wasn't until days later that anyone could even pin down where he'd been. It turned out Kurt had gone to a party at a duplex on Harvard Avenue. The kind of half-organized teenage gathering that draws in friends of friends, light beer, vague supervision, and music that plays too loud and too long. Some accounts said it was mostly older kids, maybe in their early 20s. There were conflicting stories about what Kurt drank or if he drank at all. He reportedly felt sick at some point, was seen lying on a mattress in the basement, semi-conscious. Someone said he might have had something slipped into his drink. Others insisted he left the party on foot, alone, disoriented. And then he disappeared. For 5 days, there was nothing. No sightings, no calls. His parents, Ron and Dorothy, were frantic. They canvassed the neighborhood, taped flyers to telephone poles, walked up and down streets, asking questions. Police, at first, weren't much help. Just another teen runaway, a phase. They'll come back when they're hungry or bored. But the Sovas didn't believe that. They knew their son, and they knew something was wrong. Then, 5 days later, his body was found. It was lying in a ravine behind a warehouse just a few hundred yards from his house. That's the first thing that didn't make sense. The area had been searched multiple times during those 5 days by police, by dogs, by volunteers. But suddenly, there he was, fully clothed, shoes missing, no visible injuries, no sign of struggle, just dead. The coroner ruled the cause of death as probable acute alcohol poisoning. But probable is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. The official story was that Kurt drank too much, passed out, and somehow ended up dead in a ravine that had already been searched. No explanation for how he got there, no sign of alcohol containers near the body. No clarity on where he'd been for the previous 5 days. Just speculation dressed up in formal language. And then came the stranger parts. One witness later dismissed claimed she saw Kurt after he was supposedly dead, wandering around barefoot in the area. Another claimed to have seen him being helped into a van by 2 men. And one of Kurt's friends, the last to see him alive, told police inconsistent stories. The people at the party clammed up. Some moved away. Others refused to talk. Eventually, the investigation stalled. There were no charges, no arrests, and no motive. But perhaps the most unsettling part was this. The ravine where Kurt's body was found had already been searched repeatedly. There's no plausible way dozens of people, including law enforcement, could have missed a body lying in plain sight for 5 days. Which leads to the darker theory, the one whispered but never proven, that Kurt's body was placed there, after the fact. That someone moved him, waited, hid him somewhere, then deposited him close to home once the heat died down. If true, that would mean more than one person knew what happened. It would mean a cover-up, and it would mean that someone had been watching, waiting, measuring the right moment to reintroduce a body into a scene that had already passed it by. The Sova family never stopped pressing for answers. Decades later, Kurt's case is still considered suspicious, still open, but functionally cold, just warm enough to burn, not hot enough to catch fire. And the lesson, if there is one, is this. People assume the truth will rise, that facts behave like bodies in water, they float eventually. But not always. Sometimes the truth sinks, and stays sunk, because the world doesn't operate on justice, it operates on pressure, noise, distraction, and sometimes a boy can vanish in a basement and only reappear once the silence is convenient. Which brings us to a different kind of silence. A college dorm room, a spring evening, and a young man who left his wallet, his keys, his identity behind, and stepped straight into a 60-year mystery. His name was Ronald Tamman Jr., and the door he walked out of was never opened again. 7 mysteries in, and Ohio's map is already littered with shadows. If the darkness hasn't scared you off yet, make sure you're subscribed, because there are still 26 more disappearances waiting for you. And tell me down below, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it as these stories reach you? Because the hour on your clock can change how the silence feels. Ronald Tamman Jr., 1953, Oxford, Miami University. There's something uniquely eerie about a college dorm room, not in the way of creaking floorboards or ghost stories whispered under bunk beds. No, it's in the way these rooms, identical and impersonal, become temporary shrines to youth, lives half-lived, posters, textbooks, socks on the floor, a single space caught between adolescence and autonomy. And sometimes those rooms keep more than memories. Sometimes they keep questions. That's what happened on the 19th of April, 1953, when Ronald Henry Tamman Jr., a 19-year-old sophomore at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, walked out of his dorm room and never walked back in. He was smart, studious, a psychology major and resident assistant at Fisher Hall, a building that no longer stands but once loomed like a fortress on campus. Tammin was, by all accounts, responsible. Clean-cut, the kind of young man people describe using phrases like bright future and a real head on his shoulders. He played string bass in the university orchestra. He had no known enemies, no scandal, no hidden edge, just a quiet presence in a well-ordered life. That Sunday evening, things began ordinarily. He was in his room, studying. At some point, he went to the front desk and asked for new sheets. That was around 8 p.m. It was snowing lightly outside an April fluke in southwestern Ohio. Tammin returned to his room with the sheets, and from that moment on, nothing else makes sense. The next morning, his roommate came back and found the door unlocked, the light on, the radio playing softly. The bed was made, sheets neatly folded, as if awaiting use. His wallet and car keys were still there. His coat, despite the snow, was hanging in the closet. So were his shoes. But Ronald Tammin was not. No one had seen him leave. No one reported hearing anything. Campus police were notified, then city police, then the FBI. For days, helicopters flew over the area, while search parties combed the nearby woods, fields, and the underground steam tunnels that webbed beneath the campus like hidden arteries. Nothing. Not a shred, not a hair, not a note. It was as if Tammin had stepped through a doorway that didn't exist. Investigators, desperate for direction, tried to chart a psychological map. Was he depressed? Anxious? Stressed about exams? Friends said no. Professors said he was doing well. His grades were solid. There was no hint of academic pressure, no romantic scandal, no sudden behavior changes. And yet the most infuriating thing remained. He had taken nothing with him. Not even a jacket. Just walked off into a freezing night as if going out for a breath of air and never came back. Rumors, as they do, began to multiply. One said he'd suffered a breakdown and wandered off into the woods to become a hermit. Another insisted he had been recruited voluntarily or otherwise into a government program. This was the 1952nd, after all. The Cold War was in full swing. MKUltra wasn't public knowledge yet, but whisper networks were already inventing it. Tammin was a psych major. Maybe he was noticed. Maybe someone needed him for something. And then there was the story from 1955, 2 years later. A woman in Fairbanks, Alaska, working at a hotel, claimed she saw a man who looked exactly like Ronald Tammin. He didn't give a name, but she said he seemed confused, polite, but distant. She felt so strongly about the resemblance that she later contacted the FBI. The agents flew in, took fingerprints, and compared them to Tammin's known prints. No match. Just another look-alike ghost in the fog of memory. But that wasn't the end of it. Years later, a former university employee claimed there were details about the case that had never been made public, classified records, sealed files, a quiet urgency from law enforcement that didn't match a standard missing persons case. Another tip came from a retired FBI agent who suggested, cryptically, that the agency had more information on Tammin than they ever revealed. But when pressed, the trail always went cold. Agencies denied having any remaining records, or they were lost, or the files were mysteriously missing just that one folder. Ron's family never stopped wondering. His younger siblings became adults, haunted by a brother who had never aged. His parents died, with the question still hanging in the air: what happened to Ronald? And why did nobody know? Eventually, Fisher Hall was torn down. The building that had held Ron's last known location was reduced to rubble and memory. New students walked across the same lawn, never knowing what had happened there, or what hadn't. The thing about this case is that it resists closure at every turn. If he had run away, why leave everything behind? If he had been taken, why leave no evidence of struggle? If he had simply wandered off into the cold, why didn't the dogs find a scent? Why was there no body, no bone, no scrap of fabric? Sometimes it seems as if Ron Tammon's disappearance wasn't about running from something, but being pulled into something. Not necessarily sinister, just larger, unknowable. The kind of mystery that suggests not a crime, but a rupture. A glitch in the expectation that people leave behind evidence. That absence always comes with context. But Tammon left nothing behind except an empty room, a made bed, and a radio still playing. And he wasn't the last Ohioan to disappear without explanation, not even close. Because a few hundred miles north, in another office building, a young woman named Cynthia Anderson stepped into work one August morning and walked straight out of the world. Cynthia Cindy Anderson, 1981, Toledo. If you ever walk through an office early in the morning, before the printers start humming, before the phones ring, before coffee turns humans into their semi-functional selves, you'll know a strange kind of quiet. The lights are fluorescent, the chairs still turned neatly under desks, and the silence feels so staged, it's almost theatrical. That's the silence Cynthia Anderson stepped into on the morning of the 4th of August, 1981. Or maybe she didn't. That's the mystery. Cindy was 20 years old, working as a legal secretary in Toledo, Ohio. Quiet, studious, devout. She didn't drink, didn't party. Lived at home with her parents, went to church, read romance novels. She was saving for Bible college. Her life was structured, predictable, and by all accounts, uneventful. And yet, something about her disappearance feels like it belonged to a story with shadows and false identities rather than sermons and office memos. That morning, Cindy was supposed to open up the law office where she worked. She had done it before, arrive early, unlock the doors, prep the files, start the coffee. But when her bosses showed up a bit later, the office was unlocked. The lights were on. Her purse was there, along with her keys. Her car was still in the parking lot, but Cindy wasn't at her desk. She wasn't anywhere, and she hasn't been since. No sign of struggle, no forced entry, no disturbance. Just a coffee cup that hadn't been used, a romance novel left open to a page where the female protagonist is kidnapped, and an entire life suddenly missing from the middle of a workday. That's how it starts, an empty desk and too much calm. The investigation began immediately. She hadn't taken anything with her. No money, no bag, no indication that she had planned to leave. There were no known problems at home. Her boyfriend was as shocked as her parents. And yet, this wasn't the first time Cindy had felt afraid. Weeks earlier, she had told family and friends that she was being watched. Strange calls had come into the office, silent ones, breathing on the line. She started receiving them regularly, always during her early shifts alone. And there were signs outside too. At one point, someone had spray-painted "I love you, Cindy by GW" on a wall across from the office. No one knew who GW was. It was cleaned off. Then it appeared again. A different wall. Same message. Cindy, understandably shaken, told her parents. They insisted she take precautions. She did. The law office installed a panic button under her desk. She carried pepper spray. She locked the doors, kept the blinds drawn, stayed vigilant, but it wasn't enough. The problem with fear is that people tend to dismiss it when nothing obvious follows. Anxiety gets rebranded as paranoia. Creepy turns into coincidence. People go back to work, back to church, back to pretending they're safe. Until they aren't. As leads rolled in, investigators chased a few promising threads. One centered on a former client of the law office, a man facing drug charges who may have had a grudge. There was even an informant who claimed she knew Cindy had been taken, killed, and buried under a factory. But that tip never panned out. No evidence, no body, just words and smoke. Another theory suggested Cindy had been abducted by someone she knew, someone she trusted. It made a horrible kind of sense. No signs of struggle, no screaming, no surveillance footage, because it was 1981, and the office had nothing like that. Whoever took her likely knew her schedule, knew how to move without making noise. Still, no arrests were made, and no one stepped forward to confess, not even anonymously. As the months turned into years, the story calcified. Cindy Anderson, the church-going secretary, became the symbol of the good girl who vanishes without reason. People started projecting onto her case. Some saw moral overtones, the dangers of young women working alone. Others made her into an allegory of urban decay, a sacrificial lamb of a city that couldn't protect its daughters. But the most unsettling interpretation is this, that Cindy saw it coming, that the calls, the graffiti, the intuition, none of it was irrational. She felt hunted. She said so. And she still walked into that office, because what else was she supposed to do? What if the mistake wasn't Cindy's failure to act, but everyone else's failure to believe her? Her family eventually held a memorial. A stone with no body, just a name. And to this day, her case remains officially unsolved. Like someone held down the delete key on her life and only let go once the page was blank. And if that sounds grim, just wait until you hear about Shailene Farrell, a small-town girl walking to work, one sidewalk, one direction, and somehow 0 witnesses. Shailene Farrell, 1994. Sabina, Clinton County. Sabina, Ohio, is one of those places you drive through without realizing you've entered it. A handful of stoplights, a gas station with a gravel parking lot, a few mom-and-pop stores barely holding on. The kind of town where everyone knows your first name, your parents' business, and what time you got home last night. A place so small it feels like nothing bad could ever happen there. Which is, of course, what people always say right before something does. On the morning of the 8th of August, 1994, 8-year-old Shailene Farrell left her house in Sabina to walk to her job at a nearby video rental store. It was a short walk, less than a mile. She'd made it many times before. Familiar streets, familiar faces, nothing unusual. She never arrived. No one remembers hearing a scream. No one recalls a struggle. No one saw a car speeding away or a stranger hanging around. It was as if she'd been picked up by the wind and carried into oblivion, while everyone else in Sabina blinked at the same time. At first, the response was subdued. It's a small town, people assume things will sort themselves out. Maybe she got a ride. Maybe she stopped at a friend's trapped. Maybe she quit her job. She was 18 after all, legally old enough to make strange decisions without explanation. But by the afternoon, when her co-workers confirmed she'd never clocked in, and her family realized she wasn't just late, she was gone, Sabina's collective heart skipped a beat. Search efforts began almost immediately. Volunteers walked the route she would have taken. Canine units combed the area. Police questioned locals, stopped drivers, checked back roads, creeks, cornfields, but nothing turned up. No discarded shoes, no personal items, no signs of a confrontation. Just the vanishing. And in a town as small as Sabina, that's not just rare, it's unthinkable. This wasn't Cleveland. This wasn't Columbus. This was a place where you could hear your neighbor sneeze from 2 houses down, and somehow, an entire human being disappeared between breakfast and lunchtime. What made it worse was how little narrative there was to hang on to. Shailene wasn't running from anything. She had a job, a boyfriend, a family that loved her. No substance issues, no known enemies. Her mother described her as shy but responsible. She wasn't someone who hitchhiked or wandered off. She had plans. She was supposed to start classes at a local college soon. Her future was waiting right there, no more than a half-hour walk from her front door. And then, nothing. As weeks passed, theories began to fester like old fruit. Maybe she was abducted by someone she knew. Maybe it was a random crime. Maybe she got into a vehicle willingly, thinking it was safe. But without witnesses or evidence, speculation was all anyone had. Rumors swirled, people pointed fingers, a few names were floated. Guys from out of town, guys with records, but none of it stuck. The silence around her case became oppressive, like the town itself was holding its breath for answers that never came. Years later, investigators would revisit the case with fresh eyes, looking for anything that might have been missed. New forensic tools, fresh interviews, tip lines. Still nothing. Shailene Farrell remained a name on a poster, a fading photo taped to the bulletin board in a police station, a haunting what if whispered among residents who still remember where they were when they heard the news. But perhaps the most unsettling part isn't the lack of clues, it's the complete absence of context. The world loves a mystery with crumbs, even if they lead nowhere, a torn piece of clothing, a strange call, a cryptic note. But Shailene left nothing, not even the illusion of a lead, just a girl walking to work who never arrived, her life cut cleanly out of the frame, leaving no ripples in the water. And maybe that's the real horror, not a dramatic abduction, not a sinister figure lurking in the shadows, but the realization that a person can walk out of their house and never be seen again in broad daylight, in plain sight. That someone can vanish without permission, without cause, without a trace, and the world keeps spinning as if it didn't notice. Sabina remembers, though. Her name still comes up in conversation at diners, at high school reunions, in the spaces between stories where people trade disbelief like currency. The kind of memory that gets passed down even to those who weren't there to experience it firsthand. And the silence left by Shailene's absence? It never stopped echoing. But Sabina wouldn't be the last small town to lose a daughter without explanation. 2 years later, and just a few towns over, another young woman named Carrie Culberson got into her car after a fight with her boyfriend and drove straight into legend. Because in this part of Ohio, vanishing doesn't just happen once, it repeats itself relentlessly. Carrie Culberson, 1996, Blanchester. In the southern Ohio village of Blanchester, time moves a little slower. The town is just over a square mile in size. Not the kind of place that hosts much drama beyond the occasional high school football game or the odd late-night argument that everyone pretends not to overhear. But in August of 1996, something happened that tore through the quiet like a storm through cornfields. Carrie Culberson, 22 years old, went missing. Not in the shadowy, uncertain way that invites doubt, but in the kind of way that forces people to choose sides before they even know what they're arguing about. Carrie had been out late that night, the 28th of August, visiting a friend and attending a volleyball game. She drove a bright red Honda Civic, a detail no one forgets because it's the last known object tethering her to this earth. After the game, she dropped off her friend around 11:30 p.m. and said she was heading home, but she never made it. When she didn't show up the next morning, her family immediately sensed something was wrong. This wasn't like Carrie. She was punctual, communicative, especially with her mother, who she called daily. Within hours, the anxiety bloomed into action. Phone calls, drive-bys, flyers, police, but no sign of Carrie, no sign of the car, no accident, no goodbye. Just blank space where a life used to be. But this story didn't stay blank for long. Everyone in Blanchester knew about Carrie's relationship with Vincent Doan, her on-again, off-again boyfriend. And they knew it wasn't good. Friends and neighbors had witnessed the fights, the yelling, the way he showed up uninvited. Possessive, controlling. There were whispers about what he might be capable of, and whether Carrie had been trying to pull away. According to those closest to her, she had been. She was making plans, creating space, trying to extract herself from a relationship that had begun to feel more like a sentence than a choice. So naturally, when she disappeared, people looked at him first. Vincent Doane said he hadn't seen her that night. Then he changed his story, said she'd come by briefly, that they argued, that she left. Again, no sign of the car. No surveillance cameras. This was 1996. No cell phone records, just gaps, suspicious ones. Police searched his property, found inconsistencies, a suspicious cleaning job, oddly timed phone calls, a sense that everyone around him was tightening their lips, but none of it was enough. You can't prosecute someone just because you know in your bones they did it. At least, not yet. Months passed. The story grew teeth. People took sides. Some swore up and down that Doane was guilty. Others said there was no proof, just bias and bitterness. But the tension in Blanchester was palpable. Every red car was scrutinized. Every rumor was treated like gospel. Carrie's family stood at the center of it all, grieving without a grave. And then came the twist. In 1997, over a year after her disappearance, the state of Ohio brought murder charges against Vincent Doane, despite the fact that Carrie's body had never been found. A rare move, even riskier, in a small-town case like this. But prosecutors believed they had enough. Circumstantial evidence piled high. Witnesses willing to testify. Inconsistencies that formed their own kind of outline, an invisible body traced in lies. The trial was tense. National headlines hovering just outside the courtroom. Prosecutors painted Doane as controlling, jealous, capable of rage. The defense leaned on the missing body, the lack of physical evidence, the possibility that Carrie had simply left. Maybe she'd started over. Maybe she was still out there. But the jury didn't buy it. Doane was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Legally, the case was closed. But emotionally, not even close. Because here's the thing, Carrie Culberson's body has never been found, nor has her car. No grave, no rusting chassis at the bottom of a lake, no trace of where she went after that last night on the road. Her family believes she's somewhere nearby, that she was buried in haste, that someone, even now, knows. But if that person exists, they haven't come forward, and time hasn't loosened their grip. The conviction brought a certain kind of closure, but not the kind anyone really wants. It's the kind that tells you who, but not where. It gives you guilt, not peace. And so Carrie lingers at gas stations in memory, in every red car that drives through Blanchester, in every empty stretch of road between the known and the guessed. And if you think that's the worst part, conviction without recovery, consider this. The next girl disappeared without even a suspect. 13-year-old Sharon Pretorius didn't have a controlling boyfriend. She didn't have enemies or drama. All she had was a bike and an afternoon plan. And still, she never came home. Sharon Pretorius, 1973, Columbus. There's a quiet kind of horror that sits in the gaps of normal routines. A child steps outside to run a simple errand, something as forgettable as checking on a bicycle, and never comes back. No scream, no witness, no scene. Just a missing girl and a community that has to reconcile the impossibility of her absence with the normalcy of her intentions. That was Sharon Lynn Pretorius, 13 years old, blonde, bespectacled, and by all accounts, the kind of kid who followed the rules without being reminded. She wasn't reckless, she wasn't secretive. Her world was structured, like most suburban girls' lives in the early 1972nd. School, family dinners, chores, curfews. Nothing about her seemed destined for a headline. And maybe that's what makes her disappearance so difficult to digest. She was ordinary. Her life was mundane, which makes what happened to her feel, in retrospect, violently unearned. It was the 28th of September, 1973, in Columbus, Ohio. A Friday. The Pretorius household sat on a quiet residential street, tidy lawns, modest houses, sidewalks where kids rode their bikes without thinking twice. That afternoon, Sharon was at home with her younger sister. Her parents were out. At some point, Sharon mentioned she was going to check on her bike, which she'd left at the corner store a few blocks away. Nothing unusual about that. It was the kind of errand a teenager could run without needing permission. A few minutes out, and then right back. Except, she didn't come back. Her sister waited, then called around. When her parents returned home and Sharon still hadn't appeared, the waiting turned to worry, then panic. By nightfall, police had been notified. Officers combed the neighborhood. Volunteers knocked on doors. The store confirmed that the bike had been left there earlier but was now gone. No one remembered seeing Sharon retrieve it. No one remembered seeing Sharon at all. It was the kind of case that felt, even then, like it was already slipping away. There was no crime scene, no physical evidence, no struggle, just a missing child and a bike that had disappeared with her. Investigators searched drainage ditches, alleys, abandoned buildings. They interviewed classmates, teachers, neighbors, delivery drivers. No useful information surfaced. No one had seen Sharon walking. No one saw her leave with anyone. There was no reported suspicious activity in the area that day. No strange cars, no unknown figures, nothing. As weeks turned into months, the initial shock dulled into a low-grade dread that never left the neighborhood. The posters faded, the search parties disbanded. Leads trickled in, some sincere, others disturbingly opportunistic, but none led anywhere. A few psychics offered theories. A handful of witnesses came forward with sightings that turned out to be wrong girls in the wrong city. And still, Sharon remained missing. Not abducted, not murdered, just missing. And here's where the story gets murky, in a very specific, bureaucratic way. By the mid-1972nd, there was no federal database for missing children. There were no Amber Alerts, no centralized clearinghouse, no coordinated multi-state system. So, unless a missing child's case had clear evidence of abduction, or unless the family was loud enough to keep pressure on the system, quietly let the case rot in a drawer, cold cases were something people mourned, not solved. Sharon's family did what they could. They spoke to the press. They appeared on radio shows. Her name appeared in local papers, briefly. But it was hard to sustain public interest in a case with no updates, no new information, no twists. Eventually, the headlines turned elsewhere. But the family didn't forget. Her younger sister carried the weight of that day for decades, the memory of watching the front door, expecting Sharon to walk back in with the bike she'd gone to retrieve. Their parents never gave up hope, but time makes even hope feel traitorous after a while. You start to think about bones in rivers. You start to scan the faces of strangers in airports. You start to accept that maybe you'll never really know anything. And yet, one question always stuck out. Who took the bike? It's the most minor of details, but it matters. If someone took the bike, did they also take Sharon? Was it staged? Or was the bike never taken at all, just moved, hidden, or forgotten in a moment of chaos? And if she did get to the store and simply vanished afterward, why did no one see her? In broad daylight. On a Friday afternoon, in a neighborhood where everybody knew everybody. Unless, of course, someone did see her and chose not to speak, or forgot, or remembered too late. Years later, Sharon's case still appears on missing person databases, a quiet entry among thousands. Her age progression images depict what she might have looked like at 30, then 50. Portraits of ghosts that never aged, that never got a chance to. No one knows if she was taken by someone close or by a passing stranger. But the result is the same, a story with no middle and no end, only a beginning that repeats every time a child leaves the house and doesn't come back. And if you think the loss of a teenager is hard to comprehend, wait until the missing person is still learning to walk. The next case involves a toddler, a front door left slightly ajar, and a mother who only looked away for a moment. Baby Karen Spencer was just 16 months old when she vanished from her home and from history. Baby Karen Spencer, 1957, Cincinnati, South Fairmount. If you want to feel the fragility of life condensed into a single story, look no further than a toddler who vanishes from the safety of her own home. Not a busy street, not a mall, not even a park. Her own house, the one place everyone agrees is supposed to be untouchable. That's what happened on the 16th of December, 1957, in the South Fairmount neighborhood of Cincinnati. 16-month-old Karen Spencer was there, in her home, alive and restless in the way babies always are. And then she wasn't. Karen was born into an ordinary working-class family. Her parents lived in a modest 2-story brick home, tucked into one of those tightly packed Cincinnati hillsides where houses lean toward each other like conspirators. That day started uneventfully. Karen's mother had a few household chores to do. Karen toddled around, exploring the small spaces of her world kitchen, living room, the stretch of floor where she liked to wobble with new steps. But sometime in the early afternoon, her mother noticed the front door was slightly open, a detail so small it barely registered at first. A draft, maybe. A latch not quite clicked. But then came the realization. Karen was gone. Panic bloomed instantly. The neighborhood erupted into action. Neighbors searched yards and alleys. Volunteers ran through the winding side streets. The police were called. Patrol cars and foot officers spread across South Fairmount. Within hours, a full-scale search was underway. Creeks were checked, basements opened, garages scoured. But Karen was nowhere. A toddler doesn't just vanish. She can't get far. She can't climb fences or hail a cab. A child that age is a magnet for attention. And yet, she left no trail at all. The first theory was simple. She wandered off. Maybe she slipped outside and toddled into trouble, into a storm drain, a creek, or one of the many steep hillsides near the neighborhood. But no physical evidence supported that. No footprints in the dirt, no clothing snagged, no remains found even after exhaustive searches. And what kind of 6-month-old manages to make herself invisible in broad daylight? The idea that she simply toddled into the void is possible, but barely. Then came the darker speculation. Abduction. South Fairmount, in the 1952nd, was a dense patchwork of homes, factories, and corner stores. People came and went. Delivery trucks rumbled down the streets. Strangers weren't unusual. Could someone have slipped in, snatched the baby, and disappeared before anyone noticed? It seemed unthinkable. But the unthinkable is what usually survives in stories like this. Some neighbors reported seeing an unfamiliar man around the area that day. Others claimed they noticed a car idling suspiciously. But the details shifted with each retelling, the way community gossip always does. The police followed up, of course, but nothing stuck. Without hard evidence, the abduction theory remained a rumor, hovering above the case, like a stubborn fog. And here's where things turn even more frustrating. In 1957, child abduction cases weren't handled the way they are today. There was no Amber Alert system, no mass communication strategy, no instant FBI involvement. Cases lived and died on local effort. If nothing turned up in the first days, momentum slowed. Attention shifted. Families were left to carry the weight themselves. Karen's family never saw her again. Not at a bus stop. Not on a missing child flyer decades later. No confessions. No credible sightings. Just silence. And silence ages badly. For the next half-century, Her case has lingered in Cincinnati lore as one of the city's oldest unresolved mysteries. Every so often, it gets mentioned in retrospectives, an eerie line on a timeline of local tragedies. People cluck their tongues, shake their heads, and repeat the mantra, "She was only a baby," as if saying it out loud will force the universe to explain itself. But the universe doesn't explain, it just leaves gaps. And in those gaps, families are forced to build their own stories. Some of Karen's relatives believed she had been taken and raised by someone else, her identity hidden in plain sight. Others accepted that she had died that same day and that her body was simply never found. Two versions of truth, equally unsatisfying, both unprovable. The real cruelty of baby Karen's disappearance isn't only that she's gone, it's that she had no chance to become anything more. Most missing persons stories have backstory. College dreams, arguments with boyfriends, hints of rebellion. Karen never got that far. She was frozen at 16 months old, forever pre-verbal, forever in diapers, a ghost of potential rather than a ghost of memory. And maybe that's why her case still feels jagged around the edges. Because how do you reconcile a child too young to even say her name vanishing from the safest place she should have had? How do you keep faith in the solidity of walls and doors after that? The only answer is, you don't. You accept that sometimes safety is nothing more than a story we tell ourselves. And if the disappearance of a toddler rattled Cincinnati in the 52nd, imagine what it meant when a grown woman in the 92nd vanished, her body later found floating in the Ohio River, while her car, the one thing that should have tied her to the world, never surfaced at all. That was the case of Alana Laney Gwinner. Alana Laney Gwinner, 1997, Fairfield, Butler County. Alana Gwinner Laney to her friends was 23 years old in December 1997. She was the kind of person who kept her life on track. She had a job at a local veterinary clinic, plans for the future, a cat named Mischief waiting at home. Her friends remembered her as the reliable one, the one who showed up when she said she would, the one who didn't leave people hanging. And maybe that's why her disappearance still cuts so sharply through the memory of Fairfield, Ohio. Because if someone like Laney could vanish, then the unspoken promise that responsibility protects you was suddenly revealed for the myth it is. On the 10th of December, 1997, she went out to Gilmore Bowling Lanes in Fairfield for league night, a normal Wednesday evening. She wasn't drinking heavily, just socializing, rolling frames, being part of the routine. Around 11:30 p.m., she told friends she was leaving, said her goodbyes, and walked into the winter night toward her car, a white Honda Civic. The parking lot wasn't crowded. No witnesses recall anything out of place. She started the car, pulled out, and disappeared into the sort of Ohio night where everything feels muted and ordinary. Except she never made it home. Her family noticed quickly. Laney wasn't the type to vanish without word. By the next morning, when she failed to show up at work, alarms went off. Friends called her apartment. No answer. Her boss, her parents, everyone who knew her, it didn't take them long to realize this wasn't one of those cases where someone needed space. Something was wrong. Days later, the wrongness revealed itself. On the 11th of January, 1998, just over a month later, Laney's body was found in the Ohio River near Warsaw, Kentucky, about 40 miles from Fairfield. She had been submerged for weeks, carried downstream by the currents. The official cause of death wasn't released in detail, but investigators immediately ruled the case a homicide. The manner in which she ended up in that river wasn't an accident. But here's the strangest detail. Her car has never been found. That white Honda Civic, last seen in the Fairfield bowling alley parking lot, has never resurfaced. Police checked riverbanks, ponds, junkyards. Nothing. It simply vanished, as if it had been erased from the record along with her last drive home. Over the years, theories piled up. Some suspected she was targeted by someone she knew, lured away from the bowling alley under false pretenses. Others suggested a random act of violence, a stranger encounter that ended in the river. Investigators interviewed ex-boyfriends, co-workers, bowling teammates. No one was ever charged. No clear suspect emerged. The case grew colder as the years grew longer. Her family never stopped fighting for her memory. They described her as independent, kind, someone who wanted to work with animals her whole life. Her mother in particular became vocal, never allowing her daughter's name to fade from the local conversation. But time has a way of dimming the edges. Today, Lainey is remembered as a question more than a person. The girl who left bowling one night and never came back. And maybe that's the sharpest wound of all. The car. Cars don't vanish. Cars rust, cars sink, cars get resold. But they don't disappear into myth, unless someone makes them. And if someone was able to erase that piece of evidence so completely, then the real story of what happened to Lainey Gwinner may still be parked, hidden, or crushed into unrecognizable steel, somewhere just out of sight. Because sometimes the river only gives back part of the story. Eugene Cavett, 1982, Cleveland. If Lainey Gwinner's case leaves you with the image of an empty parking lot and a car that never reappeared, then the story of Eugene Cavett offers a cruel mirror. This time, the missing teen was eventually found, but the discovery only deepened the confusion. It was 1,982-inch Cleveland. Eugene was a teenager, just 15 years old, bright, full of restless energy, caught between childhood and adulthood. Like many kids his age, he was learning how to navigate freedom, testing curfews, making friends outside the safe circle of family, exploring the edges of the city in ways parents never quite approve of, but can't fully prevent. On the night he disappeared, he had been out with friends, moving through the familiar rhythm of Cleveland's neighborhoods. And then, at some point in the late evening, he simply didn't come home. At first, it felt like the kind of teenage rebellion parents dread but endure. Maybe he was staying with a friend. Maybe he lost track of time. But days passed, and there was no Eugene, no calls, no explanations, no sightings, just an absence that expanded with each passing hour. Months later, the search ended when his body was discovered in a ravine on the outskirts of the city. By then, decomposition had erased many answers. There were no obvious signs pointing to violence, but no clear evidence of natural causes either. Investigators called it suspicious. Families called it incomprehensible. Here's the problem. The circumstances didn't add up. He wasn't dressed for rough terrain, suggesting he hadn't intended to go wandering into the ravine. The path wasn't one he was known to take. There were no witnesses placing him nearby, and the time gap, months without a trace, only compounded the confusion. Had he died the night he disappeared? Or was he somewhere else, alive, for days or weeks before ending up in that ravine? Friends remembered him as happy-go-lucky. No one suggested he had reason to vanish on purpose. Police searched for connections to crime in the area, gangs, drug activity, anything, but nothing concrete stuck. His family was left with a partial answer. Yes, he was gone. But no, they didn't know why. And the cruelest part? Sometimes finding the body doesn't close the case, it just freezes it in place. Eugene's family had a grave to visit, but they never had resolution. They could bury their son, but they couldn't bury the questions. Because when someone is found without explanation, it's not really an ending. It's just a puzzle, with one piece revealed and the rest missing. Chief Mel Wiley, 1985, Hinckley Township, Medina County. By now, the pattern is starting to feel familiar. Disappearances don't discriminate. Children, teenagers, young women, they all can vanish. But what about the authority figures? The people who are supposed to be searching for the missing, not joining them? That's the strangeness of Chief Mel Wiley's disappearance in 1985. Wiley wasn't just a civilian, he was the police chief of Hinckley Township in Medina County. A man with a badge, a gun, and a reputation for order. And yet, on the 28th of July of that year, he vanished in a way that still feels cinematic, like something out of a noir film. Wiley was 47, divorced, known to locals as personable, occasionally private, and deeply invested in his role as chief. That summer day began as unremarkably as any other. But later that evening, his car was found abandoned at Lakefront State Park in Cleveland, locked, parked neatly, no signs of a struggle. Inside were his wallet, his police ID, and his uniform. But no Mel Wiley. The search launched quickly. Colleagues, deputies, park rangers, they scoured the shoreline, dragged parts of Lake Erie, checked nearby wooded areas. Nothing. No footprints leading away. No items discarded. Just an empty car and a man who had stepped out of his own life like someone leaving a jacket on a chair. Theories bloomed, as they always do when the missing person is an authority figure. Some believed Wiley had staged his disappearance, frustrated with his personal life, burned out from the job, maybe craving a restart somewhere anonymous. Others thought something darker: corruption, enemies, debts that caught up with him. And then, of course, the simplest explanation: an accident. Perhaps he drowned in the lake and his body was never recovered, but search efforts found no trace of that either. Wiley's disappearance unsettled the community more than most. When a child goes missing, people mourn. When a teenager vanishes, people worry about bad influences. But when a police chief disappears, people start questioning the foundations. If even the law can slip away, then who's left to keep order? Over time, Wiley became a ghost of Medina County lore. The officer who disappeared, the chief who walked out of history. His case remains unsolved, a cold file with more speculation than evidence. And the irony doesn't stop there, because just a few decades later, another Ohio family would know the same silence when their daughter, a young mother named Jane Bowen, walked down a Columbus street and never came back. Jane Bowen, 2014, Columbus. Columbus in April doesn't feel like a place where someone can disappear. The air is still cool, but spring has cracked open the sidewalks. People are outside again, shaking off the winter. On the 10th of April, 2014, two-year-old Jane Bowen left her father's house near Parsons Avenue and started walking toward her sister's place. A short walk, a neighborhood route, familiar pavement. She told her family she'd be back soon. She never was. Jane was a mother of two. Her kids were the center of her world, even if her own life was unsteady. She had struggled in the way a lot of young parents do: bills, jobs that don't last, the tug of war between responsibility and survival. Still, her family insisted she wouldn't just walk away. She had plans, she had commitments. Her disappearance was abrupt in the kind of way that doesn't leave much room for voluntary absence. Parsons Avenue isn't the prettiest street in Columbus. It's long, lined with strip malls and aging houses, patched sidewalks, and a reputation for being rougher than most neighborhoods. That's where Jane was last seen walking alone. She carried no luggage, made no goodbyes. She just vanished into the landscape, as if swallowed by the city. Police opened a missing person investigation, but there were no solid leads. No witnesses who saw what happened after she turned the corner. No cameras that caught her last steps. Friends reported hearing from her briefly before the disappearance, but her phone stopped working soon after. Her bank accounts froze. Her trail ended right there on Parsons Avenue, with no footprints to follow. Her family has fought to keep her name alive ever since. Posters, vigils, interviews. They don't let time bury her. And it isn't just because of Jamie. It's because she was one of several women in Ohio to vanish under eerily similar circumstances. Each of them young, each of them mothers, each of them last seen on foot. The pattern gnawed at the community. especially in places already tired of being ignored. But the official case remains unsolved. Police say they have no evidence of foul play, no body, no crime scene. Yet how does someone with no resources simply vanish off a city street? How do you explain silence that complete? The paradox is haunting. Without proof of harm, officials hesitate to declare tragedy, but without proof of life, what else can it be? Her family says she was taken. They say she would never abandon her children. And you don't need to know much about Jane to believe them. A mother doesn't leave that easily. If she had, there would have been a signal, a sighting, a rumor that stuck. Instead, there's nothing. Just a young woman walking down a street in Columbus, and then nothing. And that nothing still stretches on, 10 years long, threatening to stretch forever. Amy Mihalovic, 1989, Bay Village. If Ohio has one case that defined childhood danger in the suburbs, it's the disappearance of 10-year-old Amy Mihalovic. Her story is told and retold because it strikes right at the heart of the illusion people cling to that children are safe in broad daylight in wealthy suburbs with parents nearby. Amy's case proves that illusion was always fragile. Bay Village, 1989. Manicured lawns, lakefront houses, good schools, parents who trusted the community. Amy was a fifth grader, smart, friendly, with a hint of independence starting to show. On the 27th of October, she walked to the Bay Square shopping center after school. She told friends she was meeting someone there, an unknown man who had called her at home earlier in the week. He told her he wanted help picking out a gift for her mother, who had just gotten a promotion. It was a clever story, specific enough to sound real, flattering enough to work on a trusting child. Amy believed him. She went to the shopping center. Witnesses saw her talking to a man near Baskin-Robbins, and that was the last time she was seen alive. For months, her face was everywhere. Posters, milk cartons, news broadcasts. Entire neighborhoods searched, but the weeks dragged into months. It wasn't until February 1990 that her body was discovered in a field in rural Ashland County, about 50 miles away. She had been killed, but investigators never found enough evidence to identify the person who lured her away. Decades later, the case remains unsolved. DNA evidence has been tested. Suspects have been questioned. Tips have poured in from across the country, but no one has ever been arrested. The man who called her, who tricked her with a story about her mother, has never been identified. He's still out there, or maybe he isn't. Maybe he died without ever confessing. Maybe he's still alive, blending in somewhere, enjoying the anonymity of aging. The cruelty of Amy's case isn't just in what happened to her, it's in how carefully planned it was. This wasn't random. Someone called her house, used personal details, and manipulated her trust. That level of preparation suggests someone who had done it before or planned to do it again, which makes the lack of an arrest not just tragic, but terrifying. Bay Village has never fully recovered from her disappearance. The case still looms over the town like a shadow cast decades long. Ask anyone who grew up there in the 92nd, and they'll tell you, Amy's story was the bedtime warning, the whispered cautionary tale. Proof that even safe neighborhoods had cracks, and sometimes those cracks swallowed children whole. John Doe, Cleveland, found 1980, ID restored in 2025. Sometimes, the mystery isn't a disappearance, it's an identity, a body with no name, a life stripped of its backstory. These cases are known as John Does, and they linger in morgues and databases for years, sometimes decades, waiting for science to catch up with memory. In 1980, the body of a man was found in Cleveland. For years, no one knew who he was. No family came forward. No missing persons case matched. His name was erased, leaving only the placeholder, John Doe. He remained that way for 45 years. Then, in 2025, the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office, working with the Ohio Attorney General and advances in forensic genealogy, gave him his name back. Danny Lee Mitchell. A man missing since 1980. For decades, Danny had been both everywhere and nowhere, filed away in cold case records, an anonymous presence in the city's history. And for decades, his family must have wondered, guessed, hoped. Now they know, but knowing doesn't necessarily bring peace. It brings new questions. What happened to him in those final moments? Why did it take 45 years to stitch his story back together? In the end, cases like Danny's remind us that even when the body is found, the mystery doesn't go away. Sometimes all you get is a name on a piece of paper. The rest, the why, the how, the who, remains forever out of reach. And Danny's case isn't unique, because in another Ohio county, another John Doe was discovered decades later, this time in 2020, and his identity, too, wouldn't be restored until years had passed. John Doe, found 2020, Canton Twip, Stark County, ID in 2024. The year 2020 will always be remembered for the noise. Constant headlines, constant upheaval, constant fear. But tucked into the chaos of that year, in Stark County, Ohio, was a story that barely registered beyond the local paper. A man's body was found in Canton Township. No ID, no wallet, no immediate connection to anyone who could claim him. For years, he was simply another John Doe. What makes John Doe cases so unsettling is the duality. The person is present and absent at the same time. You know they existed, there's a body right there. But without a name, without a history, they become abstractions. You can't talk about their childhood, their family, their mistakes or triumphs. You can only talk about the discovery, a body, a date, a place. And that isn't a story. It's a void dressed up as evidence. For this man, that void lasted 4 years. Investigators searched databases, compared dental records, checked fingerprints. Nothing matched. Families with missing loved ones hoped, sometimes desperately, that he was theirs, because being found is still better than never knowing. But one by one, DNA comparisons came back negative. No connections. No answers. It wasn't until July 2024 that the mystery finally shifted. With the help of forensic genealogy, scientists were able to map his DNA against public databases, constructing family trees from distant cousins, great uncles, third cousins twice removed. Slowly, painstakingly, a name emerged: Michael Allen Leach. Michael had been missing. His story hadn't made national news, but for his family, the silence had been deafening. For 4 years, they carried the weight of not knowing. Now, they knew. But as is often the case with identities restored, the discovery didn't come with neat closure. Michael's death is still being investigated as a homicide. There are still questions about where he was, who he was with, and why his life ended in Canton Township. The difference now is that investigators aren't chasing a ghost. They're chasing the story of a man with a name, a history, a family, which is something, but it still isn't enough. Because to his loved ones, Michael is more than the line, John Doe found 2020. He's a human being. And to the rest of us, he's another reminder that the John Doe label is never really about anonymity, it's about delay. A delay in knowing, a delay in closure, a delay in admitting how often people slip through the cracks unnoticed. And if 4 years of anonymity feels cruel, imagine 24. John Doe, found 2001, Canton 2P, Stark County, ID in 2025. It was March 2001 when authorities found the body of another unidentified man in Canton Township. Unlike some disappearances, this case didn't come with fanfare. No media circus, no national spotlight. Just another John Doe file in the county system, quietly aging while the world moved on. Year after year, the case gathered dust. Investigators tried what tools they had: fingerprints, dental comparisons, missing persons reports. Nothing matched. As time passed, the technology improved, but resources didn't always follow. This John Doe lingered at the bottom of the pile. Not forgotten exactly, but not urgent either. What's disturbing about long-term unidentified cases is how they turn into furniture in the bureaucratic room. Everyone knows they're there, but no one knows what to do with them. They're too old to solve easily, too new to let go of, so they sit. And meanwhile, families in other towns go decades without answers, not realizing the missing brother or uncle they've been praying for is already lying in a morgue freezer, just a county or two away. In 2025, that changed. Forensic genealogy again provided the missing bridge. Using the same process that had identified so many others in recent years, scientists pieced together this John Doe's lineage. The result was a name, Anthony Bernard Gully. He had been missing from Pontiac, Michigan, since 2001. He was only 39 years old when he vanished. Think about that gap. 24 years of uncertainty, all while his family lived in the purgatory of not knowing. And then, in a single press conference, the waiting ended. But the relief was tempered by the realization that his story was still unfinished. Anthony's case is now an open homicide investigation. Knowing his name doesn't reveal the circumstances. It doesn't tell you how he ended up dead in Ohio when his life was in Michigan. It doesn't tell you who was with him in those final moments. But it does rehumanize him. He isn't John Doe anymore. He's Anthony, a man with a city, a family, a set of experiences, and now finally recognition. For his loved ones, that matters more than anything. And for the rest of us, it's a reminder. Behind every John Doe file is someone who once walked, laughed, loved, and lived. Someone who was never supposed to be reduced to a case number. But while some does get their names back, others spend decades waiting for someone to care enough to connect the dots. Toledo Jane Doe, found 1987, ID in 2025. The body of a woman was discovered in Toledo, Ohio. In 1987, for almost 40 years, she was just Jane Doe. No name, no backstory. Just a woman who'd lived and died, reduced to anonymity. For decades, her case sat cold. She was described, cataloged, stored, age estimated, height noted, clothing recorded. Sketches circulated black and white composites that never quite looked like anyone in particular, but no family ever stepped forward. No missing persons case matched her profile. She remained a question mark in Toledo's history, another unsolved entry in the ledger of forgotten people. It wasn't until 2025 that her identity was restored. Using advanced genetic genealogy, investigators connected her to family members who had been searching for years. Her name was revealed as Tammy Lowe, a woman with roots, with people who had loved her, who had waited decades for the phone call that finally came. The announcement hit like a quiet thunderclap. For 40 years, Tammy had been Jane Doe, a nameless presence in cold case files. Now she was Tammy again, daughter, relative, person. The identification didn't explain everything. It didn't reveal why she ended up where she did. It didn't solve the mystery of her death, but it ended the indignity of anonymity. For her family, the weight was almost unbearable. Imagine knowing someone is missing for 40 years, imagining every scenario, clinging to every rumor, and then finding out they'd been lying in a county file all along. Relief, anger, sadness, and gratitude swirl together in ways that don't make sense to anyone who hasn't lived it. Her case is closed, in one sense her identity restored, but still open in another, because naming her doesn't erase the mystery of what happened. It just reframes it. She is no longer Jane Doe. She is Tammy Lowe. And now, the questions belong to her story, not to a placeholder. And if Toledo Jane Doe had to wait nearly 4 decades for her name back, another unidentified man from Cleveland has never had that privilege. Found in the flats during the 1982nd, He still has no name and no one waiting at the end of the line. John Thillison, Ohio man missing 2004. ID in 2024. Sometimes, the answer to a disappearance doesn't come where you expect it. Sometimes, the person you've been looking for isn't even in the same state. In 2004, John Thillison was reported missing from Ohio. He was in his 30s, a man with family who cared and wanted answers. But days turned into weeks, weeks into years, and John never came home. His name was added to databases, his face circulated in missing person flyers. Eventually, as the years piled up, hope narrowed to a sliver. His family still wondered, still checked, still waited for a phone call that never came. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Phoenix, Arizona, a body was discovered in 2004. A man dead on the sidewalk, unidentified. The coroner labeled him as a John Doe, filed the report, and his case slipped into the anonymous backlog of America's unclaimed dead. Two parallel stories, both unfinished, ran side by side for nearly 20 years. One family searching for John in Ohio, one medical examiner in Arizona holding an unidentified man with no family. The overlap was invisible. Until 2024. Advances in DNA technology finally caught up with the silence. Samples from John's relatives were compared against the unidentified decedent in Arizona. The match was undeniable. The man who had been lying in Phoenix since 2004 was indeed John Thillison. After 20 years, his family finally got an answer. But answers don't always mean closure. Yes, they knew where John was. Yes, he was no longer lost. But the circumstances of his death remained unclear. Why Phoenix? Why was he alone? What led him to leave Ohio and end up in Arizona in the first place? These are the questions that remain after an identification. The body is named, but the story is still incomplete. For his family, at least the limbo of missing has ended. But now begins the harder task, building a narrative from fragments, trying to turn a death certificate into an explanation. John's case is a reminder that missing doesn't always mean lost forever. Sometimes the truth exists, tucked away in another jurisdiction, another state, waiting for someone to notice the lines that connect. And sometimes those lines don't appear until decades later. Charlotte Trego, 2014. Chillicothe. If Ohio has a cluster of disappearances that feels almost mythic, it's the Chillicothe cases. Between 2013 and 2015, 6 women vanished or died under suspicious circumstances in and around the small city, turning Chillicothe into the epicenter of whispered theories about serial predators and systemic failures. Charlotte Trego was the first. She was 27 years old when she disappeared in May 2014. She was last seen leaving her home in Chillicothe, planning to run errands. That was it. She never came back. Charlotte's life, like many of the women in the Chillicothe cluster, wasn't simple. She had struggled with health problems, financial instability, and circumstances that made her vulnerable. But her disappearance wasn't just another statistic. It was the spark that lit the community's realization that something dark was happening. Her family reported her missing quickly. They knew Charlotte wouldn't just walk away. She had loved ones who depended on her, a routine she didn't abandon lightly. And yet, despite searches, media coverage, and growing concern, no trace of Charlotte has ever been found. The cruel irony is that because of her vulnerabilities, law enforcement was slower to treat her case with urgency. When adults with complicated lives go missing, suspicion falls not on foul play but on choice. Maybe she left voluntarily. Maybe she wanted space. Maybe she was running from something. But Charlotte's loved ones insist that wasn't her. Her disappearance became the first thread in a much larger, tangled web. Over the next year, other women, Wanda Lemons, Holly Logan, Tamika Lynch, Shasta Himmelrich, Tiffany Sayer, would also vanish or turn up dead in or near Chillicothe. The pattern was too stark to ignore. Suddenly, Charlotte's disappearance wasn't just one family's nightmare. It was the beginning of a local crisis. But for Charlotte herself, the questions remain. Where did she go? Who saw her last? Why has there never been a confirmed sighting since that day in May 2014? Her name is now tied permanently to the phrase, Chillicothe Missing Women. She's not just Charlotte anymore, she's part of a grim collective, a story bigger than her, but one that begins with her absence. And while theories abound, serial predators, trafficking, police indifference, none of them have brought Charlotte home. She remains the first missing piece in a puzzle that refuses to complete itself. And what came after Charlotte only deepened the dread, because months later, another woman from Chillicothe, Wanda Lemons, would vanish as well. And once again, silence would be the loudest sound left behind. Wanda Jean Lemons, 2014, Chillicothe. If Charlotte Trago's disappearance was the crack in the surface, Wanda Lemons was the proof that the fracture wasn't a fluke. By November of 2014, just 6 months after Charlotte vanished, Wanda disappeared too. Another young woman from the same small Ohio town, gone without a trace. And suddenly, Chillicothe wasn't just unlucky, it was starting to look cursed. Wanda was 37 years old, a mother, a friend, known for her sense of humor and her stubborn streak. Her life, like Charlotte's, had its complications. She bounced between odd jobs, faced financial hardship, and lived in a world that made her vulnerable. But she was also the kind of person people remembered. People cared about her. People noticed when she was missing. She was last seen around Thanksgiving 2014, reportedly leaving with a man in a truck. After that, silence. Her phone went dead. Her routine collapsed. No one saw her again. The circumstances around her disappearance were muddled by conflicting stories. Some people said she had plans to leave town. Others suggested she'd been caught up in something dangerous. But her family was adamant. Wanda wouldn't have just walked away. Not without telling someone. Not without leaving a trail. Her case was quickly linked in the public imagination to Charlotte's SOS. And then, as the months unfolded, to the other women who would go missing or die in the Chillicothe area between 2013 and 2015. The community began to ask out loud, was there a predator targeting women in this city? Was Chillicothe harboring a serial killer? Or was something more systemic at play? Poverty, drugs, exploitation, erasing women who society didn't protect? Investigators at first resisted the idea of a pattern. Each case was treated separately. But families and advocates pointed out the obvious. Too many young women, too many similar circumstances, too close together in time and place. Something was happening. Something bigger than coincidence. To this day, Wanda's fate is unknown. Her body has never been found. Her family has never stopped searching. They describe her as funny, loving, full of quirks that made her unforgettable. For them, she isn't just part of a grim list of missing women. She's Wanda, and her absence is a wound that never closed. What makes her case so haunting is the way it feeds into the Chillicothe narrative. Alone, her disappearance is tragic, but alongside Charlotte's and the others, it becomes almost unbearable. Because if one woman can vanish, it's a mystery. If 2 vanish, it's a pattern. And if 6 vanish or die in the span of 2 years, it's a crisis. But crises don't always come with answers. Wanda is still gone, and Chillicothe still remembers. Holly Renee Logan, 2013, Columbus. Before the Chillicothe disappearances shook southern Ohio, there was Holly Logan in Columbus. She went missing in 2013, just a year before Charlotte and Wanda. And, while her case didn't get the same kind of clustered media attention, it has since been connected by people who see the overlap in circumstances. Holly was 30 years old, a mother, and known by friends to be warm and generous despite her struggles. Like many of the Chillicothe women, her life was complicated by addiction and economic instability. She was last seen in Columbus, reportedly near Parsons Avenue, the same street where, a year later, Jamie Bowen would vanish. That overlap alone makes her case part of a larger, unsettling picture. Holly's disappearance was quiet at first. Missing adult cases often are. Unless there's immediate evidence of foul play, police tend to assume the person may have left voluntarily, especially if the individual has a lifestyle that leaves them vulnerable. But her family knew better. They insisted she would never abandon her children, never vanish without explanation. As time passed, the silence grew louder. No body was found. No confirmed sightings surfaced. Just absence. And absence is heavy. Her case gained renewed attention only after the Chillicothe cluster began making headlines. Suddenly, Holly's name was mentioned alongside Charlotte, Wanda, Tiffany, Shasta, and Tamika. 6 women, similar backgrounds, similar disappearances. The geography was tight, the timeline compressed. Together, their cases felt less like coincidence and more like a collective cry for attention. But Holly herself has never been found. Her story, like the others, remains unresolved. And maybe the most tragic thing is how easily her case could have been overlooked if not for the larger pattern. It raises the question, how many other women, missing in similar ways, never even make it into the narrative? How many disappear quietly, without the benefit of being part of a pattern that makes people pay attention? Holly's case reminds us that every name in the Chillicothe cluster is also an individual, not just part of a statistic, but a person with children, with family, with stories left unfinished. Tamika Lynch, 2014, Chillicothe. When Tamika Lynch disappeared in May 2014, the Chillicothe story turned from unsettling to undeniable. She vanished the same day as Charlotte Trago, 2 women, gone within hours of each other, in the same small town. If one disappearance was a tragedy and 2 a pattern, then this was something darker. Tamika was 30 years old, a mother of 3. She was described as outgoing, resilient, someone who could light up a room. Like Charlotte, she had struggled with addiction, a fact that made her more vulnerable and cruelly less likely to be treated with urgency by authorities. But her family knew she wouldn't just leave her kids. She wouldn't vanish without reason. Her body was found days later in Paint Creek, just outside Chillicothe. Officially, her death was not ruled a homicide. Authorities suggested drowning, possibly accidental, but her family disagreed. They believed she was killed, that she didn't end up in the creek by chance. They argued that the circumstances of her disappearance, coupled with a larger pattern of missing women, pointed to foul play. The dispute over her death has never been resolved. Officially, it remains undetermined. Unofficially, her name lives alongside Charlotte's, Wanda's, Holly's, Shasta's, and Tiffany's as part of the Chillicothe 6. Her case embodies the cruel paradox of closure. Her family found her body, but they didn't find answers. In some ways, that's worse. Because having a body without an explanation is like holding a book with the last page missing. You know how it ends, but not why. And the not why is the part that keeps you awake at night. For Chillicothe, Tamika's death only amplified the fear. 2 women gone in the same week, one never found, one found dead, and still no answers. Suddenly, every mother, sister, and daughter in town was viewed through a lens of dread. Would they be next? Would they vanish too? And as the weeks turned to months, the fear proved justified, because Chillicothe wasn't finished. Another young woman, Shasta Himmelrich, would soon join the list. And her story would deepen the nightmare in a way that still divides opinion to this day. Shasta Himmelrich, 2014-2015, Chillicothe. By Christmas of 2014, Chillicothe was already tense. 2 women, Charlotte Trago and Tamika Lynch, had gone missing earlier that year, one still unaccounted for, the other found dead in Paint Creek. Families whispered. Reporters circled. Theories floated between neighbors like cold breath in the winter air. And then, on Christmas Day, 20-year-old Shasta Himmelrich left her house and walked straight into the same unsolved darkness that had already swallowed others. Shasta was young, hopeful, and complicated. She'd been described as bubbly and fun-loving, but also struggling with personal battles that made her vulnerable in a town where vulnerability was starting to look like a liability. On Christmas morning, she left her fiancé's house in her white Chevy Cavalier, saying she was heading out briefly and would be back soon. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Her car was discovered later that day near the Scioto River, parked oddly on the side of the road. Inside were her keys, her wallet, and the engagement ring her fiancé had just given her. The placement felt deliberate, almost staged. The sight chilled her family. She hadn't even had the ring long enough for it to lose its shine, and now it sat abandoned, a haunting symbol of promises cut short. For several weeks, search parties combed the area. Flyers went up. Her family pleaded for answers. The town, already wary from the other disappearances, held its breath again. Then, in early January 2015, her body was discovered in the Scioto River, just downstream from where her car had been left. Authorities ruled her death a probable suicide. They argued that the evidence suggested she had walked into the river herself, but her family has never accepted that conclusion. They point to the context, the string of other missing and dead women in Chillicothe, the odd placement of her belongings, the lack of any note or indication she was planning to take her own life. To them, the official explanation feels like an erasure, a convenient label that allows investigators to close a file instead of digging deeper. The truth is probably more complex than either narrative allows, but complexity doesn't comfort families, certainty does, and certainty has never come. Shasta remains another entry in the Chillicothe mystery, another young woman claimed by a small Ohio city's season of vanishing. And she wasn't the last. Just months later, another woman, Tiffany Sayer, would disappear. Tiffany Sayer, 2015, Chillicothe. By the summer of 2015, Chillicothe was living in fear. First Charlotte, then Wanda, then Tamika, then Shasta. Each case blurred into the next, until the town felt less like a community and more like a crime scene. And then came Tiffany. Tiffany Sayer was 26 years old. A mother of two, she was known for her kindness, her warmth, and her resilience. She was also vulnerable financially and socially in the same way as several of the other Chillicothe women. It was that vulnerability that tied her story to theirs and cemented the perception that something was systematically targeting women in this city. On May 11, 2015, Tiffany told a friend she was going out for the evening. She was last seen at a party in Chillicothe. At some point that night, she left. Where she went, who she went with, and what happened after remain questions that have never been answered. Her disappearance immediately raised alarm bells because of the timing and the pattern. Families of the other missing women were already speaking out, demanding accountability. And now, another name joined the list. A month later, Tiffany's body was found in a remote area near a creek, wrapped in what authorities described as makeshift covering. The discovery confirmed what many already feared. She hadn't walked away. She hadn't chosen to vanish. Something had been done to her. Her death was officially ruled a homicide, but no one has ever been charged. Investigators questioned acquaintances, pursued leads, even considered whether Tiffany's case was linked to the others. But with no strong suspects and no confession, the case went cold. Her family remembers her not as part of the Chillicothe Six, but as Tiffany, a mother, a daughter, a woman who loved and was loved. But the public remembers her as part of the cluster, part of the grim narrative that gave Chillicothe its reputation. And that reputation lingers. Because while officials downplay the idea of a serial killer, the clustering is undeniable. 6 women in 2 years, dead or missing. And still, no clear answers. Tiffany's death was supposed to be the last in the sequence, but Chillicothe's scars remain raw. Families keep fighting for recognition, for answers, for justice. And for outsiders, the haunting question remains: was Chillicothe cursed by coincidence, or did something much darker weave its way through the city in those years? Stacy Colbert, 1998, Columbus. Not all of Ohio's disappearances are clustered in small towns. Some happen right in the middle of cities, in places where life moves quickly and anonymity is easy to slip into. That's the story of Stacy Colbert, an Ohio State University graduate who vanished in Columbus in March 1998. Stacy was 23 years old, independent, ambitious, and living alone in her apartment in the Clintonville neighborhood. She worked at Chase Bank, had a wide circle of friends, and was known for being reliable, but on the weekend of the 20th of March, she went silent. She didn't show up to work the following Monday. Friends couldn't reach her. Concern escalated quickly. Police checked her apartment. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. Her car was still there. Everything inside looked normal. It was as if she had stepped out for groceries and never returned. For years, Stacy was simply missing. Her family endured the endless cycle of hope and despair that comes with not knowing. Rumors circulated. Some speculated she'd been abducted by someone she knew. Others suggested she might have crossed paths with a stranger. But there was no evidence, no witnesses, nothing to anchor any of the theories. Then, in 2004, 6 years later, her remains were discovered in a remote wooded area in southern Delaware County. The case shifted from a disappearance to a homicide. But even with her body found, investigators couldn't determine who was responsible. No arrests were ever made, no suspects named. Her family got part of the closure they had begged for. They could lay her to rest. But the harder part, the why and the who, remains unanswered. Stacy's case is one of those that stings doubly. She was found, but her killer is still free. In Columbus, her name is remembered as a reminder that even in a city filled with people, where the streets are crowded and the apartments packed close together, someone can disappear without anyone noticing. And even when they're found, the mystery doesn't end. It just changes shape. And Stacy's case isn't unique in that way. Just 8 years earlier, another Ohio woman, Angela Hicks, would vanish under almost identical circumstances, only to be found murdered later with her killer never identified. Angela Hicks, 1990, Elyria. The story of Angela Hicks begins in Elyria, Ohio, in 1990. She was 18 years old, standing right on the line between girlhood and adulthood, balancing dreams and daily life the way so many people do at that age. Angela was described as kind, bright, and driven, someone who wanted to build something for herself in a city that didn't always offer young people an easy path forward. In May of that year, Angela vanished. She was last seen near her home in Elyria. Friends expected her later that day. Family waited for her to show up as usual, but she didn't done. And unlike some of the other cases, hers did not linger as a missing story for long. Angela's body was later discovered, but her death only deepened the mystery. Investigators were certain it was homicide, but who did it and why? The answers were never clear. Despite interviews, searches, and countless hours spent combing through leads, the case grew cold. Angela's killer has never been identified. Her disappearance and death sit at a painful intersection of tragedy. She wasn't gone long enough to leave people with years of limbo, yet she was gone soon enough that no one ever got answers. Families sometimes say that not knowing is the worst pain, but knowing only part of the truth can be just as unbearable. Angela's loved ones were left with that kind of grief. They had her body, but no story to explain it, no accountability, no justice. In Elyria, Angela's case still casts a shadow. She is remembered at vigils, mentioned in conversations about unsolved murders in Ohio. Her name is part of the larger list of women in the state whose disappearances or deaths were never resolved. And though the years keep stacking, her story refuses to disappear. What makes Angela's case especially haunting is that she could easily have been anyone, a teenager stepping into adulthood, caught in the everyday routine of life, and then suddenly pulled out of it forever. Her story reminds us that sometimes mysteries don't sprawl across decades of uncertainty. Sometimes they arrive quickly, brutally, and remain unfinished forever. And just when you think the roll call of unsolved disappearances has reached its end, Ohio proves it has another waiting. Even in recent years, new cases of missing people have appeared, some only solved through the newest tools of genetic genealogy. One of the most recent, and one of the most poignant, is the case of a man whose remains were only identified in 2025, 2 years after he was found in Cuyahoga County. Cuyahoga County, 2023, decedent ID in 2025. The case began quietly, without the drama that usually fuels headlines. In March 2023, the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office took custody of the remains of a man found in Cleveland. At the time, he was simply another unidentified decedent, another line in a county report that fills with too many of those every year. No one stepped forward. No identification was possible. He became another anonymous entry, known to investigators only as 2023 John Doe. But anonymity is not the same as being forgotten. Forensic scientists kept samples. DNA was submitted in 2024 for advanced testing. Months passed. Computers traced family trees across databases, climbing branches and connecting twigs. And in April 2025, the man finally had his name back, Nathaniel Dabrowski. For his family, the announcement was both relief and heartbreak. Relief because the waiting ended. Heartbreak because the ending had already happened in 2023. They just hadn't known it yet. Nathaniel was gone, but now he was no longer a phantom. He had form again. His name was spoken aloud. The exact circumstances of his death remain unsolved, but in a way, his identification is a testament to how mysteries in the 21st century are being reshaped. In earlier decades, Nathaniel might have remained John Doe forever. His family might have lived and died without knowing where he went. Instead, technology reached across the void, stitching him back into the world of the known. But closure is a tricky word. For Nathaniel's loved ones, answers don't end the story. They open new ones. Why Cleveland? Why then? Why in those circumstances? An identification, after all, is only the beginning of a different kind of mystery. And yet, in the larger list of Ohio's missing and unidentified, his case stands as the most recent proof that the phenomenon isn't slowing down, that Ohio's ledger of mysteries is still being written. The lingering silence. When you trace these 33 stories in order, from Brian Schaefer in 2006 to Nathaniel Dabrowski in 2025, the pattern is undeniable. Ohio is a state built on Middle America's sense of familiarity. Football, family cookouts, highways, cutting through endless small towns, and yet within that normalcy exists a haunting truth. People vanish here. Sometimes they vanish into thin air. Sometimes they are found but remain unnamed. Sometimes they are identified only decades later. And sometimes they are found quickly, but their killers are never caught. The stories cross eras. They span the post-war 1952 with Beverly Potts and baby Karen Spencer, to the chaotic 1982 with Ronald Tamman and Cynthia Anderson, to the technological breakthroughs of the 2022 that can restore names to those who had been waiting for decades. But through it all, one theme echoes: disappearance has no expiration date. For families, the waiting is infinite. For communities, the wounds resurface with every anniversary. For investigators, the files pile higher, their weight a constant reminder of what remains unsolved. And for the rest of us, these stories leave an aftertaste we can't shake. Because if people can vanish from neighborhoods, from college campuses, from small towns and big cities alike, then the comforting story we tell ourselves that disappearances happen somewhere else, to someone else, is shattered. What makes the Ohio missing person mysteries so compelling isn't just the number of them or the length of time they span. It's that they remain unresolved, even when partially solved. A body found isn't an explanation. A name restored isn't a conclusion. A conviction decades later doesn't erase the years of uncertainty. Every answer is still shadowed by deeper unknowns. So what do we do with the silence? We carry it. We retell it. We remind ourselves that every name on this list was once a person who laughed, planned, loved, and walked through Ohio streets that still exist today. And maybe, by repeating their stories, we hold the silence at bay just enough to keep their absence from becoming erasure. But the truth lingers. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to haunt, to remind us of fragility, to unsettle our belief in safety. And Ohio, more than most places, carries those mysteries like invisible monuments, standing taller than its stadiums, stretching longer than its highways, whispering to anyone who dares to listen. Because in the end, it isn't the answers that keep us awake. It's the questions that will never be answered. And Ohio has more than its share.